Hello? All right, I guess we're all set. Things seem to be working right. I apologize for the most recent philosophy talk. What happened is that my mic had a short in it, and I didn't know that. And consequently, it was putting out all kinds of static, and I think it probably made for an unpleasant experience for people who were wanting to listen. This is not the first time this has happened. A few years ago, a mic wire came loose and was in the air, and it picked up a local Mexican radio station. And then a few weeks later, I got a message from YouTube saying, you have violated copyrights. And what it was that the music that was playing on the Mexican radio station could be heard very faintly in the background. And that the music that was playing was under copyright, and I hadn't gone through the right procedures in order to make it legal. Since I don't make any money on this, I don't monetize any of these videos or audios. There's no problem about it. All right. As you've noticed, this is a new camera, and it's much clearer, and I'm starting to make updates. In fact, I'm using a radio mic now instead of a mic on the end of a cord. And there's going to be other changes. I'm trying to do more things, and I'm trying to do a poor man's variety of updating things. So in coming talks, things will be different. All right. Now, after almost a year of looking at fractions of life astrologically, we have finished that subsection. And tonight is the introduction to a new subsection. We won't get all the way through the introduction because it turned out to be much longer and larger than I intended. That frequently happens. So we'll get so far, we'll get the most important things done this evening. This is a subsection on methods that astrologers use to work with futurity. This subsection will be much more like most of what other astrologers do. Of course, the presentation will not be standard because I'm not a standard person. Now, I'm much more of a mystic than I am an astrologer. And so I have not really gone deeply into a lot of the mathematical, technical parts of astrology. I'm more interested in understanding people's problems and helping them to work with them. I started out as a predictor, and I did fairly well. But I was more interested in forecasting than in predicting. If a person has an understanding of what kind of season they're going through and what opportunities it affords them and what are the pitfalls, that to me is more valuable than making some kind of a prediction. People usually freeze over predictions anyway. They become frightened and panicked and all of that. Now, some of the material that we're going to be going through in the coming months is something that I'm not thoroughly familiar with. And therefore, if there are people watching, and I'm sure there are, that are crack astrologers mathematically, I'm open to corrections and I'm open to questions. All right. Now we want to talk about time. If we think about time, we have the past, the present, and the future. the past is factual, the present is actual, and the future is potential. We live and act in the present. If we try to live in either the past or in the future, we're out of focus with reality, and we're not likely to get the most out of the moment, of the present things. So we want to be in the now and in the present. We can't stay really absolute about that. What it is that the present can expand into both the past and the future. This is why people do spiritual exercises, because with spiritual exercises, the moment that we are living in can be expanded into what is normally the future for most people, or the past for most people. And that's what the expansion of consciousness is all about. Now, sometimes we linger on effects from the past. And, we've all met people like that. They become nostalgiacs. The good old days were the only good days in the past. I just heard a recent quote from the world's champion chess player. And he was asked, who is the best chess player ever? And he said, me 2 years ago. Meaning to say that he thinks his game has regressed. But that may be a matter of nostalgia. Sometimes people are more interested in the future than they are in the present. And sometimes that's a happy thing. Children looking forward to a birthday and a birthday party with presents, that's sort of living in the future and anticipating it. However, if you have a bill that's due and the due date is coming up, that's not a pleasant way of looking at the future. So, again, from a mystical perspective, the present with an expanded consciousness extends into both the past and the future. The ability to see the past and the future, it depends on how deeply we are living into the now. If we really understand what's happening in the moment, we get a sense of the things in the past that have led into it with causes. It's something like logical deductions, and the same thing with the future. See, if I do this, this is thus and so is going to happen. And with that being the case, that's the beginning of an expansion. But there are people whose consciousness expands into the past and future in quite remarkable ways, but we're not talking about accomplished mystics. One way we can look at the nature of the present in relation to the unknown, the forgotten past, or the coming future, is to imagine oneself in the middle of a forest on a dark night. If you manage to get a fire going, the light from the fire produces a circle of light, and in that circle of light you can see where you can get more fuel for the fire. You put more fuel on the fire and you can see further into the forest, and you can see where you can get more wood if that's what you're interested in, but you gradually can expand in such a way. That's an image that's good and bad. The attitude that is not so good, the good part is when you can see into the forest, you can see that there aren't all kinds of fantastic, phantasmagorical creatures out there trying to get you. And the bad part is that if that's all you see, it's rather prosaic, and you develop an attitude of thinking there are no phantasmagorical creatures out there. All right, as you can see, this is not a mathematical introduction. We're going to look at some ideas that are positional and mathematical after a while. But this, I guess I could say that I'm a moralist. And I've learned a lot of lessons about the future. Just recently, several years ago, I said something I shouldn't have said to a young person, and it put her into a tailspin. And I feel grievous about it because I have a certain responsibility. Astrology doesn't give us pat answers to anything. It's about character and people's lives. And we want to improve people's lives and help them deal with hard things or to get the most out of the good things. And we don't want to make their life more miserable or create more problems for them. So when it comes to forecasting or predicting, being accurate is a good thing, but it's not as important as being righteous in such a way that what you're doing is something that people are going to benefit by. Okay. So far, we have seen that the present is the present. And it is not merely a consequence of previous causes. It is now, and it has a quality that is real about it. There's something genuine about being present in the moment. We can see that a lot of the moment is a consequence of things from the past. But we also see that there are things streaming to us from the future that are new and that are unprecedented. A lot of those things coming to us are things that are consequences from our previous deeds, but there are always unforeseen moments, unforeseen things that are coming. So, the future is filled with potential of things that could be, that we don't know about. So, we're going to talk for a few minutes about potential. We said the future is potential. Potentiality is a state that is between the known or knowable and the unknown. Some see potential as between being and non-being. And both of those are valid. That state that is between being and non-being could be called could be. Something has to could be before it can be. Now, potential, as mystics use the word, does not mean the same thing as it does in physics. In physics, like potential is measured in volts, meaning that it has this potential ability to change things. That's not the way we're using it. We're using the word potential to mean something like a undefined seedbed in which creation manifests. Potential, just like the universe means one thing. And potential is also a monism. But because we look at potential, because we look at what could be from a dualistic viewpoint, the dualistic viewpoint being spiritual and material, things are either more spiritual or more material, and or a fusion between the two of them. So we say that potential is dualistic. And the dualism of potential is time and space. Now again, we have to be careful about these, the use of these words, because these are also words that we use differently than they are used in physics. The use of time and space as we see it now in physics is a subset of a much greater view of potential. It is a subset that relates to the physical world that we live in. That's what physics deals with. They don't know about the other spiritual world. They don't even want to hear about them. Though occasionally you do run into a physicist that does have some spiritual inclinations and follows them. So we have two co-potentials, time and space. And they are, because they are about something that is monistic, that because they are about something that is one, they can't exist independently. You can't have space without time, or you can't utilize the potential of space without time, and you can't measure time without space. So they are intertwined. Obviously, some things are far more timely, and other things are more spatial. Spiritual things are more about time. Material things and forms and things like that are more about space. There is in manifest being, there is that same kind of dual polarity that there is with time and space, and it is called the spirit-matter pole. Going in one direction, things become more spiritual. And spiritual things are much more qualitative, and they're much more creative. Going in the other direction on the spirit-matter pole, things are much more material. Things are, how do you say it? They're more receptive. They hold form. They're not just a spirit, but they are forms through which spirit can be seen or be made manifest. So we see that anything that occurs in reality occurs in time and space are potentials for things to manifest in. And we can understand the manifestations by understanding their relationships to time and space. This is like solving, if a train leaves town going at 15 miles an hour and another train comes from another, those kind of problems that we solved when we were in grade school. All right. In the creation, in manifestation, things originate in spirit, and they proceed from spirit to matter. You could say that the cosmos that we live in is really a top-down cosmos. Spirit creates, and matter responds. Spirit has life, matter has form. We're not talking only about this matter, we're talking about even the matter that is the stuff of our thoughts and of our emotions. Things of spirit are way beyond that. So, it is when we materialize things, because matter doesn't have waking character, and it is unknown and basically ignorant, it is the proving of what spirit knows by creating forms in matter and finalizing them, and in finalizing them we come to know the reality of our thoughts. If we have a thought about building something and we don't build it, we don't know if our thought was true. But if we build it and things are out of skew, I had a friend once, I was going to build a building on a lot, and he was doing it all in his mind, and he didn't take the angular perspective into account, and if he had built that house, it would have stuck out into this, one of the corners would have stuck out into the street. So you can see that that matter is a proving ground. That's where things are followed. Now, in this we see that time is more like spirit. Space is more like matter. Even materialistic thought has some of this in it. Like Einsteinian thought, matter curves space. That is to say that the manifestation of matter causes a change in space. Einstein also said that time is relative according to our consciousness. I think he said something that if you're with a pretty girl, time goes by very swiftly. But if you have to be listening to an astrology class, it might drag a little. All right, but we get the whole idea. Now, these are some of the ideas of time and space that we're going to be working with. And now we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty, and for the rest of this evening, it's going to be the beginning of a survey of techniques of astrology. Now, there are too many techniques to cover in one evening. In fact, just introducing the techniques, if we wanted to go about it slowly, we could take an entire year to do that. I'm tedious, but I'm not quite that tedious. So, when there are a lot of techniques to try and understand the same thing, or a lot of theories to try to understand the same thing, and the theories are all not very much the same, that usually means that we really don't know what it is that we're dealing with. That is to say that if you take all of the methods of forecasting or predicting in astrology, you find out that some work and some don't work. But even the ones that work and that have the best batting average don't always work. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. That's because destiny and what is manifest is in destiny is not completely known. And the problem is that we have incomplete knowledge. In fact, it's probably not possible, in fact, I would almost say it's certain, that we can't know what the future holds. I've been told that when a candidate is up for great spiritual advancement and there is a spiritual teacher that would help that person, they give them a trial. But no matter how well they know that individual, they know that individual better than the individual knows it's him or herself, they don't know what the outcome of that trial is going to be. Obviously, the whole future is not written out. It's something that we gain, that we learn little by little. The most common technique for addressing the future astrologically is called the method of transits. Transit is an astronomical term. The word transit means to pass, or to pass through, or to pass over. We say we have a mass transit system. That is, it transits us from one place to another. Astronomically speaking, a transit is when anything passes over the meridian that you live at, the meridian of longitude. That is to say that a true north-south line. So if we go by natural noon, when it is noon, the sun is transiting our location. That's where the word transit comes. Now transits could be called, and some old-fashioned astrologers still call them, primary progressions. Not secondary, which are much more popular, primary progressions because they're listing of the progress of the planets after birth. Progressions always deal with the movements of planets. Directions have more to do with the movements of angles, of like cusps and things like that. So sometimes transits could be called natural progressions because they are true to nature and there's no abstraction in them. So transits are a relationship of one moment of time to another moment of time. The first moment of time is an event. It is birth. After birth, each moment, each second, each minute, each hour has a relationship to that event moment. And so when you're talking about studying astrological transits, you're seeing at one moment in time how that relates back to the original moment. The idea being that the birth chart is the original moment, and that has the entire character for this life abbreviated in it in the moment. So the birth time is a reference moment. And the natal horoscope represents an initiation or an inauguration of a life. The word inauguration is a very interesting word. It has in it the word augur, which is where it's made from. Augur means to foretell something. We say there are auguries, which are something like omens foretelling the future. So when you start something, it has in it, in that start, it has a lot of its outcome. I think there's an old maxim that says, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. Or what is in the seed is what becomes in the plant. Now, they're called natural progressions, or transits, that is, are called natural progressions because they're natural. We can see where the planets and the stars and things like that are going to be. So, if they relate back to something that is inaugurated in a particular moment, they see how the future is, what circumstances, what is inaugurated in that moment is going to encounter. And so what you do is you reference moments back to the original reference. Now, the movements of heavenly bodies are regular and they're constant. Because of this, we can quite accurately predict where the planets are going to be. So that if a person is born right now on September 1st, 2022, we can know 5 years from now where the planets are going to be in September 1st, 2027. And we have tables like that. They're either computerized or they are in books, and they're called ephemerides. And in the ephemeris, the positions of the planets are given for each day. And so then you can see when how those planets are going to be relating into the future. You can do it with the past too, if you like. I did that at one time. At once I had a very small mystical experience that completely changed my life. And later on I thought, well, I should go back and look and see what was there. And when I looked at the transits on that day, it was very clear that that kind of event could take place at that time. So if you see where the planets are and how they relate, and the relationships of the transiting planet to the natal planet are the same things that we use throughout astrology. You look for aspects. If a planet passes over a planet in your chart, that chart is going to be activated. So that is the most common form of forecasting or predicting, is the methods of transits, and if you're very old-fashioned, you can call it the method of primary progressions. This is just an introduction. We're certainly going to have at least one talk just strictly on transits alone, with as many examples as we can. Now, usually with transits, astrologers work only with the outer planets. And the reason for that is the outer planets move so slowly that they will be close to a position that activates the natal horoscope. They'll be there for a long time. And this is one of the principles of astrology. The duration of an influence on a particular part of the horoscope determines on how well it will sink in. And so planets that are moving very slowly to almost like standing still, that constant beaming in of the character of that planet is going to have more effect. Like if you take the transits of something like Mercury or the Moon, there's some of them last for an hour or two, and then poof, it's all done. You know, you could be taking a nap at that time and miss the whole business. So the duration of the astronomical, astrological influence is a major determiner of the effect. So slow things. All right. Now we're going to move on to the next two techniques. And we're only going to, the second one that we get to, we're not going to get very far because what we're doing is very big. Now I want to call back some images that we have looked at in previous talks in this series on astrodynamics. And I want to redraw on those images because now we're going to get a little bit more sophisticated and we're going to be a little bit more, using them a little bit more. Suppose you have a circular pool of water. And suppose you can get right over the center of that circular pool and you drop something in so that it strikes the center of the pool. What happens is waves come out from that impact, the moment of impact. And the closer, the waves that are closest to the moment of impact are the highest waves because the friction, the viscosity of the water has not eaten up the energy. So that by the time if it's a large pool, by the time you get out to the edge of the pool, it's almost flat. It's barely a ripple. Now, the moment of the impact is like the moment of birth. And waves represent enlargements of that impact. The original impact is no larger than the object in the water. But the waves get bigger and bigger. And so if you look at the waves out from the impact center, you find that things are expanded, enlarged, exaggerated, and you can see more clearly what's going on, which you couldn't probably see because the impact is so instantaneous that it seems to be almost timeless, and you can't you can't see what happened. But when you look at a wave, you can see things that are a lot of things in an enlarged manner. But it's sort of like enlarging a photograph. If you enlarge a photograph, you lose the sharpness of it. It's not as strong. It's not as well defined. That's the one image we began with, and we're going to come back to it in just a little bit now, but now we want to introduce a new image. And I tried to find one on the web, but the web is now so modern and sophisticated that they don't have simple things that are quite tutorial. If you have a circular tub, like the old wash tubs used to be. My guess is that most people listening to this video, watching this video, don't even have the slightest idea what a wash tub is. But if you have a wash tub, let's say it's maybe 3 feet in diameter or 4 feet or something like that, you fill it with water. And then you pour some oil on the water, colored oil so you can see it. And then you start it all spinning. You can do it with something like a paddle, or you can actually spin the whole business if you have it on something like a turntable. What happens is at the center of that tub, a vortex forms. And in that vortex, there will be a collection of oil. But at various distances, sort of like the distances of waves from dropping a stone into a pool, various subvertexes, little vertexes will form, and they will spin around the central vortex, and this is called a demonstration of the nebular hypothesis for the formation of planets. You can find diagrams and descriptions and things like that on YouTube, all kinds of them, but it's all theoretical. You're not seeing it the way you do with the wash tub. So there are some things that are good, that are good about the internet, and some things that are not so good. All right. Now that we have the second concept, the concept of the nebular hypothesis, we can look at something that we looked at also previously. We talked about Bode's law. He was a Polish astronomer, and he found out that there is an arithmetic progression as to how far away from the sun each planet formed. So now we're seeing that in the wash tub, according to the density of the water and the speed of the spinning and the oil, that's where the planets form. But Bode's law, or Bode's law, shows you, it gives you an actual measurement. And that measurement is an indication of the character of our solar system. Now it's different for other solar systems because they have different atmospheres and such like that, but we can see that there is a graphic and material relationship that is mathematical between the planets and the sun, or the central sun of a system. So we have the swimming pool, we have the wash tub, and we have Bode's material solar system. These are all images of how forms occur in space, and if we measure the spinning and the rotation, we have an idea of how they change relative to each other and how they change relative to the sun. So these are material images. What we want to do is look in a different dimension. In an inner dimension, we said that the potential of time has more to do with spirit. And what we want to do is we want to understand how waves in a vertical, how waves in time are, how we can use them to understand phenomena that happen on Earth, and from a vantage point from before their manifestation on Earth. Everything in the cosmos happens by wave action. Some people call it vibrations. But that's only a two and a half dimensional representation. Actually, everything occurs in spirals. And some of the spirals go into inner dimensions and they appear as waves, but they're actually really spirals. Now, what we're seeking is to see how spirit works into matter through waves, and how the intentions of spirit, which predetermine what's going to happen in matter, how they work into matter as in time. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for time waves. But the time waves do have correlatives in matter, in form, in the things we see around us. And what we want to do is we want to see correlatives that are relative to nature, that are natural correlations. Now, there's a plethora of astrological techniques that people try to use to forecast and predict. But for the most part, some get the idea of analogy, but they don't get the idea of a natural analogy. And a lot of them get the idea of analogy and nothing with a natural analogy, and they they come up with all kinds of theories of prediction. Some of them work, and some of them don't work. And even if they don't work, even if they work sometimes and they're not based on true science, doesn't make any difference. If you're caring about someone, you get an intuition. And you may have false knowledge, but the intuition is true. If somebody needs help in a certain way, what you're doing with a horoscope or any other means of getting to and helping a person, the more scientific it is, the more likely it is to be true, but the truth will come through anyway. Now what happens is people have these theories about how to forecast and how to predict. And if they hit on something correctly, they think that they have the truth. The intuition was the truth, but not the means that they got to it. That is not the truth. And some of these people will, with one success, will get hooked for life, and it's as if it is etched into stone or chiseled into stone, the technique that they use. Usually I find these are people who are strongly Iranian. They have one experience, and that experience captivates them for life. And they can become very dogmatic. And even though Uranus is a planet of novelty and wants extreme change, sometimes the experience of extreme change causes a dogmatism. Now, all right. So, what I'm saying is that we're going to question all of these techniques, or we're going to try to explain them in such a way that they can be questioned. Please do that with everything that is being said here. It's really important that we question until we find out what is true. You know, it's a whole way of life. Now, what we're trying to do is to find means that are based, that are analogous, that are based on nature, that there are natural analogies. That's a difficult thing to do, but we're trying to do difficult things, so let's go ahead. Now, it is a fact that a strong majority of people in the United States believe in astrology. but it's most likely that their belief in astrology is based on sun sign astrology, which is barely astrology at all. People who know astrology in its fullness often look down on sun sign astrology because it's trying to describe an entire complicated character with just one factor. It doesn't, it isn't right. And so bona fide astrologers often look down on sun sign astrology. Years ago, I used to look down on sun sign astrology also. But in recent years, I have come to appreciate and realize much more the value of the sun in astrology. For one, sun sign astrology leads people into a deeper study. I have a friend that started out reading astrology magazines off of a rack in a drugstore or wherever you buy magazines these days, and she ended up into a very deep, sophisticated view of spiritual philosophy. So the sun sign astrology can lead you in. Our lives are highly dependent on the sun. The forms of life that we see on our planet, all of the flora and the fauna and the humans couldn't exist without the sun. Everything is sun dependent. In the past, when we were hunter-gatherers or when we had an agrarian society, we were much closer to the sun and we had the appreciation of the sun. Now there are two solar cycles that dominate our lives. Two cycles, simple ones, they dominate our lives completely. They are the day cycle and the sun cycle. The day cycle depends on the revolution, on the rotation of the Earth on its axis, and the year cycle, the annual cycle, depends on the orbital revolution. So we go around the sun and we go around ourselves. Now, there is much more to the natural analogy between the day than we normally give credit. Even in grade school, we began to delve into that. We see that the active part is when the sun is up, and the more passive part, when we rest and turn inward, is the night, when the sun is not visible. Carrying that analogy to the year cycle, we have summer, when everything is alive and growing, especially in these latitudes, and then we have winter, where life turns inward and everything dies. Now, these two cycles have greater manifestations than we normally realize. Now, earlier it was said that spirit and spiritual qualities are more expressed in the potential of time. And matter and form are more expressed in the potential of space. Now, mystics find that creation proceeds from spirit to matter, which is just the opposite of materialism. Materialism thinks everything originates in matter, and if there's anything like spirit, it's an idea of sophisticated interactions of matter. We know this if we try to do creative work of our own. We draw on an idea in ourselves, and we manifest it outwardly into the substance, whether we're a sculptor or a painter or whatever. But things proceed from within outward, or things proceed from spirit to matter. And the creation is accomplished in cycles. And the cycles give repetition, and they give a rhythm, so that things can gradually, perfectly be accomplished. Now, there are some cycles that take millions of years, and there are some cycles that take a few milliseconds. We have the Krebs cycle in our body, which takes just a very few milliseconds, and our whole metabolism is dependent on a cycle that is that fast. Here in the chemical world, things happen slowly compared to things in the spiritual worlds. A thought is really fast, but to do something in the physical world is very slowly. So you might say that not only is time associated with spirit, the deeper you go into spirit, the faster the time is, or the more the time factor increases, until you get to the point that it seems like there's no time, which means that there is all time, which means it's eternity. You have, it's like in music, if you got a big long measure, you've got an eternity of time to get in the notes that you want to get in, depending on the tempo, of course. But so, all the cycles within cycles are analogous. As we continue these talks, we're going to have eventually a whole subsection on planetary cycles and how they relate to dynamic astrology. Now, if we combine the fact that there is top-down creativity and that analogy prevails throughout the cosmos, you can state that all in one sentence. And that one sentence has been stated. And in all of mysticism, it is the most famous statement of all. It's called the principle of analogy, and it is known in what is called the Hermetic axiom. And it goes, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. A thought will lead to a desire to do it. The desire to do it will lead to the energy to do it, and then finally it gets done. What began in heaven becomes manifest on earth. So all of the stuff of astrology that deals with our character follows the Hermetic axiom. As above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. Now, we want to see how this applies to dynamic astrology. The sun, we have just seen, is central, and it is involved in all natural solar cycles. Now, following this reasoning, a day is analogous to a year. So you can say that a day is a little year. So that if you study a day, you'll know about the big year. Now this gets into something pretty phenomenal. A few years ago, the national press got a hold of it, but there was a man in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that had a filling station and garage. And what happened was he studied, over the years, he studied the weather, just from observation. And if you keep tables, you can get tables for all of the weather, the average temperature, and when it is hotter than normal or cooler than normal, and things like that. And he found that at certain times of the year, if you study days, you can determine what the coming months are going to be like. For example, if you take the 3 days after the solstice or the 3 days after the equinox, you can tell what the next 3 months are going to be like. And he did this with weather. And he even had the snowplow people ordered for given days months ahead of time, which according to a meteorologist, this is crazy. But he was so accurate from having done this so many years that he could tell that from those 3 days, what the next 3 days were going to be like, maybe there was more humidity out a day, and that was a likelihood that there was going to be snow, and then he could bank on that. So this man didn't know anything about astrology. There's lore that goes back hundreds of years that there is the 12 days of Christmas, that you can do the same thing for the whole coming year, from the winter solstice, taking the next 12 days, and you can see what the next year is going to be like. But you have to have records to base that on, and astrology has all of those records. So, in astrology, if you relate a day to a year, taking the analogy, that is called a secondary progression. I should write some of these things on the blackboard. That is called a secondary progression. After the transits being the most popular, the most used tool, secondary progressions are the next most used tool. And the way it goes is you take each day after birth and you relate it back to the birth chart, and each day equals 1 year. So that if you want to see what happens when a person reaches majority, you look 21 days after birth and you look at the planets there and their relationship to the birth chart, and you'll have some idea, you have a forecasting ability for what that year is going to be like. Now we see this delineates the character in time. But it delineates the character in time differently than a progression does, than a transit does. The transit takes time as a par, and it's very, very slow. As time unfolds, every moment relates back to the original time. Here we take a year for a day, and it's a faster time. But if we take the ultimate in the other direction, when the stone hits the water, when we drop the stone, everything there is instantaneous. So everything that is going to unfold in the character is in the natal chart, but it's very hard to get at it. That's why we use these techniques. So in time, the moment of birth, the impact of the stone is instantaneous. Secondary progressions are faster than transits, which is the unfolding slowly over time. Now, we can look ahead, and in the same way we have the ephemeris for determining transits. We can use the ephemeris to see where things are going to be so and so many days after birth. But the interpretation of a secondary progression is different than the interpretation for a transit. In fact, in secondary progressions, you almost always deal with the faster moving items, like the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Moon, sometimes Mars. But they are the only ones that move fast enough so that in this natural solar cycle, remind you, the day relating to a year is a natural solar cycle, you can see it in a faster amount of time, but the outer planets have barely changed. If you look at something like Pluto, which is the extreme, if you look at Pluto 10 days after birth, it's likely to be in exactly the same place it was at birth. But Mercury or Venus or something like that, well, the sun will be 10 degrees away. And in that 10 degrees, it may be forming some kind of an aspect. Okay, so this is another means for seeing with the forecasting what kind of environment is going to be present. Now, just as it is with transits, we're going to do at least one thorough study on secondary progressions, because we're trying to learn how to do this and what we can do with this. All right, now now we have to do a kind of logic that's very difficult. We have looked at the Earth moving in its orbit, revolving around the sun. Now we want to look at the effect of the sun on the Earth rotating on its axis. We move now from secondary progressions to primary directions. No, just barely got that in. I'll leave it here so you can see it. Okay. Now we have to do a little bit of difficult, or at least compared to what we've been doing, a little bit more difficult logic. The ratio of the day cycle to the year cycle is 1 day per year. And a day is analogous to a year in nature. We see that the analogy carries through quite thoroughly. We only said a few sentences about it, but there are a lot of other things that you can see about them. Now the sun appears to move 1 degree per day. And the Earth moves forward in its orbital revolution 1 degree. Now, while the Earth is revolving around the sun, it's rotating on its axis. And one rotation takes 24 hours. And one rotation, 24 hours or 1440 minutes. Takes 1440 minutes. So in one rotation on its axis, the Earth goes through 360 degrees. We're talking very roughly here. Some of these things are measured precisely down to thousandths of a second, but 360 degrees. So if we take 360 degrees and divide it into 1440, we find 1 degree every 4 minutes of time. So you can see the math by looking mathematically at 4 minutes of time. We're looking at another way of saying what a day is like in the relationship between the day and the year. And the reason that we're going through it this way is to show that there is a natural relationship in this method of forecasting or predicting. It's based on the sun, and the sun is the center of everything, and it's based on our relationship to the sun in orbital revolution and axial rotation. And from the axial rotation, we find out that 1 degree is figuratively 4 minutes of time. So, this means that every 4 minutes of time represents 1 year. This is, you realize that you have to be really accurate when you're doing this kind of work, so that every 4 minutes is a year. If you don't have the time of birth down to seconds, you're not going to be able to do this. Very few astrologers do this, and they demand that you have exact times of birth. Since most people don't have exact times of birth, you can't do this kind of astrology. So really basically what you're saying is you take the place of birth and you take a horoscope for every 4 minutes. But after that, things splay out. What you do with the primary direction horoscopes varies from individual astrologer to individual astrologer. We do not have time to go into that now, but we are going to go into that in part 2 of this and in future talks when we deal with primary directions. All we're trying to say is that these are the most reliable means for forecasting. These are the most reliable means of predicting. Now, for people who don't know their time of birth, there is an art of guessing that is called rectification, so that you can determine from events in life when the person was born down to the second. Now, we might be having a session or 2 or more on rectification. I have no idea the way this course is going to unfold. Because there are a lot of things that are important to look into, and you can see that I have all kinds of ideas that I've already suggested for future directions that we take. But now you can see the differences in time. You can see the analogies like the waves of time. The slowest time is transits. The next more swift time is secondary progressions. A much swifter time is primary directions, and there are all different kinds of primary directions, and the swiftest amount of time is the moment of birth itself. It is all time focused on one moment. And if a person is deeply concentrated, they don't need any other techniques. They don't need transits or progressions or directions. They can just focus on a natal horoscope, and they can call up the pictures of the important events that are going to be in a person's life and how that relates to character development, and that's all in that moment of birth. So, that's as far as we're going to go tonight, but we have other things that we want to do. Now, the next time we meet will be October 6th, and things are going to be very different. I will not be offering the presentation. I may introduce it, but I will not be offering it. A friend of mine named Rick is going to offer the next presentation, and he may be offering several of them. I want to do this because because Rick and I don't always agree on everything. There may even be contradictions. We respect each other. I trust and respect him because he's very good at what he does. And it's important that you get different points of view. You know, the world, according to Richard, is a pretty stilted world. You're only seeing one point of view. So I want to have I may have other people come in. I'm trying to get in contact with another fellow now that I have good respect for and see if he wants to do anything. Now, there may be redundancy in the things that Rick does and that I do, but that's all right, because the redundancy is not going to be exactly, it's not going to be congruent. It's going to be, again, from a slightly different point of view. Even if there are differences, that's important, because an important part of astrology is discerning what works and what doesn't work, and why it works. And so it's important that we do things this way. Now, Rick is a good astrologer, and he has a lot to offer. Rick is also a very good human being, and being and character are the all when it comes to spiritual things. I don't often allow other people to give talks in a series that I'm offering, so you can, if I'm asking him to do this, it means that I really trust him. And so if I trust him, that's good for you to want to hear him. Now, things might be different technically. He might have totally different views on some of these things. I know for a fact that he's going to have a totally different view on some of these things. But that's all right. Now, we may even have a more technical setup, making it easier, and we may even, I may get a good cameraman back in here to do, because I'm not good at the camera. Now, I want to put this up. I'm going to leave this on the screen as things close. You may want to stop the video and take a screenshot of this, because this is the kind of thing that Rick is going to be working with. And if you know ahead of time and are familiar with the terms, and you can see what's happening, it'll be easier for you. I hope everything, I think everything's going on. Well, thank you very much. It's been an interesting night. I've enjoyed every bit of it, and I hope you'll learn something, and I hope that it is helpful to you.